So as I mentioned in the introductory pod, this section of the lecture will deal with the concept of what writing is and what it can be. The key aim is not to provide a definitive account, but to loosen up your ideas about writing, about its form, its shape and its contexts. Because at this point in the unit, I want you to start to really think about what constitutes writing, what it means to write, particularly in a digital or a new media environment, and how the space and mediums in which we write shape culture and the kinds of stories we tell. Because one thing is for sure, writing is not as stable a definition as some of us might think. The concept of writing and the way we write is dynamic and continually in flux. So let's take some time to think about that. Let me start by asking you something. What comes to mind when you think about writing? What's the first image you see? Take a moment and think about it. So, at first, this seems like an easy question to answer, right? Writing is alphabet, letters, words, sentences. Certainly, once upon a time, writing could be said to look like this, like the kind of writing I showed earlier, and I'd hazard a bet that that's what many of you thought of as well. Or perhaps some of you thought of writing like this, or maybe writing like this. Or perhaps you thought of writing in the form of the printed word in books. But I'm guessing, and I may be wrong, that not many of you thought of writing in the first instance like this, or like this, or this, or this. What about this? Did anyone think about this? What about this? Graffiti. Or what about this one, Welcome to Pine Point, which you've seen a couple of times already. Then there's this.
TextRain is a playful interactive installation that blurs the boundary between the familiar and the magical. Participants in the TextRain installation use the familiar instrument of their bodies to do what seems magical, to lift and play with falling letters that do not really exist. Like rain or snow, the colored text appears to land on participants' heads and arms. The text responds to the participants' motions and can be caught, lifted, and then let fall again. The falling text will land on anything darker than a certain threshold and fall whenever that obstacle is removed.
There's also this.
Is this the real life? Is this just fantasy? Caught in a landslide, no escape from reality.
So all of these images show examples of writing in all of its varied textures and complexities, and across various periods in history. Whether produced on cave walls, on screens, papyrus or paper, or as kinetic text as you're seeing now, writing is, in effect, the act of making language visible on what we might now call a surface. It's a representation of language in a graphic medium, using a set of usually agreed upon signs or symbols. So writing allows us to communicate with others beyond the bounds of spoken language, through the act of making a mark that can be seen and recognised by others. So as Michael Carter writes in his book Where Writing Begins, a postmodern reconstruction, the very word write, when traced back to its Sanskrit origins, means to wound, to tear or to cut. And it's a concept that actually harks back to the earliest forms of writing, in which sharp implements were used to cut marks into stone or bark. So as Carter notes, what makes writing writing is that it leaves those marks. Writing is those marks and the act of marking. So the nature of that mark making has of course changed dramatically over time. As some of the images I've shown you have pointed to, writing has taken the form of pictograms, which while technically aren't writing because they're drawn representation of objects, they still count as early forms because they refer to abstract concepts and stories associated with those objects pre-text. Then there's the development of the Greek, Phoenician and Roman alphabets and other writing systems which were largely based on the Egyptian use of symbols. Then we can think about graffiti tags and even by way of another example, to the development of code like HTML. So across these various periods of history then, we can see that writing has changed and grown ever more complex and textured. It's diversified according to variant cultures and language groupings, needs and usages, and as I'll talk about in the next session, as a result of changing technologies. Writing has changed in form, in context and space, and as a result, it has changed in representational capacity. So along with it, the spaces in which writing appears have evolved and they've diversified. Think caves, walls, scrolls, pages, screens, as have the tools that are used to make it. And here we can think of plant colouring and fingers, feather quills and bone, charcoal, pencils, pens, keyboards and styluses. So what has also changed, of course, is genre and form. Now, I don't plan to go into a detailed literary studies analysis, that's not our area of interest, but let me simply serve to remind you that language and written representational capacity, as it's expanded, so too historically has humankind's imaginative power for finding forms to capture it. And so we have at our disposal forms like the poem, the short story, the script, the screenplay, the news article, the feature story, the haiku, etc., etc. So bear with me, I'm going somewhere with this. So historically then, we can see that writing has evolved across the course of time to become a dreaming space, a functional space, and a recording and documenting space. And for a great many hundreds of years after the inventions of handwriting and much, much later the printing press, these forms and cognitive spaces have tended to be represented and contained by the printed page. But this brings us to the point at which we are at today, all right, and which is very much the interest of our unit. It's one that in the last few decades has required a radical rethinking of what writing is and what it can be. Because no matter where and how we engage, writing and composing are no longer, as you would all know, contained by the printed word. Now, writing inhabits the screen. In the 21st century, most writing is not even performed with pen and paper or word processing machines anymore. It takes place in other, more diverse environments. In chat rooms, blogs, vlogs, tweets, texts, forums, comments, online newspapers and journals, Snapchats, wikis, etc., etc. And the kinds of implements that we use to do it have changed dramatically too. Print notepads, they almost seem quaint. Now, most writing happens on mobile phones, iPads, laptops, desktops, smartwatches, and other digital and electronic technologies that encourage the composition of new types of text, which, with a click, can be disseminated to a large and sometimes global audience. So these applications have changed the way we think about writing and what it can do, and the way in which we communicate and interact with each other. So chat rooms, wikis and blogs, for example, well, they blur the lines between writers and readers by allowing text to be redesigned, to be added to and manipulated. Then there are other writing practices that encourage other forms of online participatory composition, such as gaming, fan fiction, and creating and upkeeping web pages that draw on collaged approaches to image, sound and text. So, as we'll discuss in more detail next session, like other inventions and technologies before it, the internet has changed writing. And that means that our definition and conceptualization of writing, well, it needs to change too. So, anthropologist Susan D. Blum, she said that in many ways, this is the wordiest and the most writerly generation in a long while. We are, she goes on to say, writing all the time. We're reading all the time. So we blog, we text, we update statuses, we chat, we comment, we tweet, we Snapchat and we game. And yet, what's really interesting, I think, about all of this is that in the midst of all of this writing, the people who are doing it often don't call it writing at all. So there's one more thing that I want to say about writing, at least for now anyway, and that is that online, in network spaces, writing has the potential to look very different too. So remember that Bohemian Rhapsody clip that I showed you? Well, look at it again here. So in his book, Literacy in the New Media Age, Gunter Kress, who I referred to in session 1, argues that the digital revolution is producing far-reaching effects in the uses, functions, forms and valuations of alphabetic writing. In fact, it's come to the point where we can no longer think about writing simply as alphabetic print, as we did pre-digital. So writing has, as Kress goes on to argue in his book, which is a very good one by the way, it's been destabilised, it's been radicalised. And that largely emerges through a new way of thinking about its sensory, imaginative and multimodal capacities. So as the kind of text you're looking at now suggests, the representative capacity of digital forms has afforded writing a distinctly visual character, where the meaning and symbolic resonance of an idea has the power to carry through via a very sophisticated merging of image, sound and text. So you might remember from session 1 that I introduced a quote from Kress's book, and I'd like to bring it back again to embed it into the discussion for this week. And it's this, just listen. It's no longer possible to think about literacy in isolation from a vast array of social, technological and economic factors. Two distinct yet related factors deserve to be particularly highlighted. These are, on the one hand, the broad move from the now centuries-long dominance of writing to the new dominance of the image, and, on the other hand, the move from the dominance of the book to the dominance of the screen. These two, Kress continues, are together producing a revolution in the uses and effects of literacy and of associated means for representing and communicating at every level and in every domain. So with this in mind, as students of writing then, you need to begin thinking, if you're not already, about how to develop your new media literacy skills so that you can make the most of the way you negotiate and utilise the modalities, genres, and the various combinations of online affordances to tell the stories that you want to tell and to communicate in a way that suits the work you are doing and the message that you wish to convey. So this is both at a personal level and also at a professional one. Because writing is still letters. It is still an invitation for an exchange, for a dialogue, for an act of recording or documentation. It's still a call for action, and it almost always imagines and seeks a response. Yet, it's also a space that requires nimbleness, flexibility, a capacity for critical analysis, and the ability to be able to quickly and confidently negotiate the vast array of rhetorical choices that will keep on becoming available to you.